The moment my father said it, the entire table nodded as if the decision had been waiting in the room long before the words were spoken. We were gathered in my parents' dining room in Dayton, Ohio. The same room where every birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner, and every family argument had unfolded for the past 30 years. The long oak table was crowded with plates, half-finished glasses of wine, and the comfortable noise of relatives talking over one another. My father cleared his throat. It was the kind of quiet signal that made everyone stop talking. Then he placed his glass on the table and said, calmly, almost casually, "From now on, Vanessa runs the family." For a moment, nobody reacted. Then my Uncle Mark nodded slowly, like the announcement confirmed something he had already expected. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "that makes sense." Across the table, my sister Vanessa smiled the way someone smiles when they've just been handed a title they believe they deserved all along. A few cousins murmured their agreement. My mother looked relieved. Even the younger relatives exchanged glances that said the same thing without words. Of course it would be Vanessa. Then everyone looked at me, not because they expected me to challenge the decision, but because they expected me not to. I had been quiet my entire life. The practical one. The careful one. The sister who observed instead of leading. They assumed I would simply nod like everyone else. What none of them knew was that 3 days later, my sister would walk into a conference room in Chicago and discover she had just stepped into my office. The silence in that room would be louder than anything my father said that night. But to understand how that moment happened, you have to understand the story my family had been telling about us for years. In the Carter family, Vanessa was always the obvious leader. She was 3 years older than me and had a kind of confidence that filled every room she walked into. When we were kids, teachers described her as outspoken and ambitious. My father called her the future of this family. Vanessa loved big ideas, big plans, big promises. I was different. I preferred listening before speaking, watching how things worked before deciding what should be changed. When Vanessa talked about how she would one day run the family business, people believed her. When I talked about law school applications, people assumed I was choosing a quiet, safe path. That story slowly became the version of reality everyone accepted. Vanessa would lead. I would support. The Carter family business had always been the center of those expectations. Carter Manufacturing sat on the edge of Dayton like a monument to our grandfather's ambition. He started it as a small metal parts shop decades ago. And by the time my father took over, the factory employed hundreds of workers across the county. But the past 10 years had not been kind to the company. Contracts disappeared. Machinery aged. Competition grew stronger. No one talked about it openly at family dinners. But everyone understood the truth. The company that once supported our entire family was struggling to survive. Which is why my father's announcement carried so much weight. Vanessa lifted her glass with a confident smile. "Well," she said lightly, "someone has to steer the ship." A few relatives laughed. My Uncle Mark leaned forward. "Your father built something incredible," he said. "Now it's time for the next generation to take over." Vanessa nodded as if she had been preparing for this moment for years. "I've already started reviewing the company numbers," she said. "There are a few opportunities we haven't explored yet." As she spoke, she tapped the stack of folders beside her plate. I noticed them immediately. They weren't casual notes. They were organized financial documents, projections, charts, investment summaries. Vanessa had clearly been working on something long before tonight. My mother reached across the table and squeezed Vanessa's hand. "Your father and I trust your judgment," she said. Across from her, my father gave a single approving nod. "Vanessa understands what this family needs," he said. The sentence hung in the air longer than he probably intended. Vanessa understands. I don't. For a moment, the room grew quiet again. Vanessa finally turned toward me with a playful expression. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, Emily." Several relatives looked in my direction again, waiting, but not for an argument. They were waiting for the same reaction I had given my entire life. Acceptance. So I smiled. I think it's great, someone's stepping up, I said calmly. Vanessa's smile widened immediately. My father looked satisfied. The conversation quickly shifted back to ordinary dinner talk, stories from work. Complaints about the weather. Someone asking for more bread. No one noticed that I barely touched my food. No one noticed how closely I studied the financial folders beside Vanessa's plate. And no one noticed the quiet vibration coming from my phone in my bag beside the chair. When I finally glanced down at the screen, a message from my assistant in Chicago flashed across it. Urgent. Board approval required. Midwest restructuring deal confirmed. Meeting scheduled this week. For a moment, I stared at the message and felt an odd sense of timing settle over the evening. Because the company involved in that deal had a name I recognized instantly. Carter Manufacturing. 3 days later, my sister Vanessa would walk into a meeting in Chicago believing she was about to secure investors to save our family business. What she didn't know was that the person responsible for approving that deal had been sitting quietly across from her at the dinner table the entire night. The next morning in Dayton was unusually quiet. I woke earlier than anyone else in the house, the pale morning light barely reaching through the curtains of my old childhood bedroom. The room looked almost exactly the same as it had when I left for college years ago. The same bookshelf, the same faded photographs of school events and family vacations. But the feeling in the house was different. My father's announcement from the night before still lingered in my mind. From now on, Vanessa runs the family. The sentence had been spoken casually, but its meaning carried real weight. In our family, leadership didn't just mean making decisions at dinner. It meant control over the future of Carter Manufacturing. And that future was far more fragile than most people at that table understood. I pulled on a sweater and walked downstairs. The kitchen was empty, except for the soft hum of the coffee maker. Morning sunlight spilled across the counter, illuminating the same stack of folders Vanessa had brought to dinner the night before. She must have left them there when everyone moved into the living room after dessert. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Curiosity had always been my weakness. One of the folders was slightly open, revealing a set of printed financial tables. I glanced down. Within seconds, my stomach tightened. These weren't casual notes about running a family company. They were detailed investment proposals, loan structures, projected revenue charts. The title at the top of one document read, Carter Manufacturing Expansion Strategy. Vanessa hadn't just been thinking about taking control of the family business. She had already started negotiating with outside investors. I slowly turned another page. The projections were ambitious. Production output doubling within 2 years. New manufacturing equipment financed through loans. Expanded contracts with regional automotive suppliers. On paper, the plan looked bold, confident. Exactly the kind of presentation that impressed people who believed confidence alone could solve complicated problems. But something about the numbers didn't feel right. Several cost estimates seemed suspiciously low. Operating expenses barely increased even though production was projected to double. And then I saw the debt column. A large loan from a regional bank. Another financing line attached to machinery purchases. I frowned. I had never heard my father mention those loans before, which meant one of two things was true. Either the family had taken on far more debt than anyone talked about at dinner, or Vanessa was planning to borrow a dangerous amount of money to make her expansion plan possible. I turned another page. A draft contract sat clipped to the back of the proposal. I leaned closer to read it. The language was familiar, legal phrasing used in investment agreements. Capital investment in exchange for equity participation. Debt restructuring. Collateral protection for investors. Then my eyes stopped on one particular clause. Personal guarantee required from company ownership. Collateral to include business property and associated family assets. For a moment, I just stared at the line. Associated family assets. That could include almost anything. The factory building. The land surrounding it. Possibly even my parents' house. I was still reading the document when footsteps appeared behind me. Careful, Vanessa said. Her voice was light, almost amused. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway with a mug of coffee in her hand. Those are important, she added. walking toward the counter. I closed the folder halfway but didn't move away from it. "You've been busy," I said. Vanessa shrugged, clearly pleased with herself. "Well, someone has to be," she replied. "That company isn't going to save itself." She leaned against the counter and took a sip of coffee. "I've been talking to investors," she continued. "Real ones. Not just the local banks Dad always deals with." I tapped one of the pages lightly. "These projections are optimistic." Vanessa laughed. "Emily, numbers always look worse on paper than they do in reality." She said it with the same easy confidence she had used at dinner. Like the details didn't really matter. "What matters is momentum," she added. "Investors love momentum." I flipped through another page. "How much debt does the company currently carry?" I asked. Vanessa waved the question away. "Enough to be annoying," she said. "But not enough to matter once we bring in outside capital." The way she said it made the situation sound simple. Too simple. At that moment, my father walked into the kitchen. "Morning," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Vanessa immediately brightened. "Dad, I was just telling Emily about the investor meetings in Chicago next week." He nodded approvingly. "That's where the real opportunities are," he said. "Big firms? Serious money." Vanessa smiled proudly. "Exactly." My father looked at me and gave a small shrug. "Your sister understands how to move things forward." The message behind his words was familiar. Vanessa leads. Emily worries. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached for my phone casually and snapped a quick picture of the contract page while they were talking. Neither of them noticed. Vanessa was already describing her upcoming meeting with investors in Chicago. "It's going to be the turning point," she said confidently. "Once they see the potential, everything changes." My father nodded again. "Good," he said. "This family needs someone willing to take risks." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, because I had just recognized the formatting on the contract. The investment network listed in the agreement was one my firm worked with regularly, which meant the investors Vanessa planned to meet in Chicago weren't strangers to me at all. They were my clients. And if that contract moved forward the way it was written, the future of Carter Manufacturing would depend on a decision made in my office. By the time the Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the buildings. The drive from Dayton always gave me too much time to think. 3 hours of open highway was more than enough time to replay the conversation in my parents' kitchen, to picture the contract clause again, and to hear Vanessa's confident voice explaining how the investors were going to change everything. She had no idea how close she had already come to the truth. Carter Manufacturing was no longer just a family problem. It had quietly entered my professional world. When I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath our office tower, the familiar calm of the place settled around me. The building stood in the middle of Chicago's financial district, surrounded by glass towers and the constant movement of the city. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was completely different from the noisy family dinners back in Dayton. Quiet, efficient, focused. The receptionist at the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter." I nodded as I walked toward the elevators. Most people in Dayton thought I worked in a quiet corporate law office somewhere in Chicago. Something predictable. Something safe. They imagined long days reviewing paperwork. They never imagined the kind of decisions being made on the upper floors of this building. The elevator opened onto the executive level. Several analysts were already moving quickly between offices, carrying reports and laptops. A few of them greeted me as I stepped out. "Morning. Emily, conference room's ready? Financial models are uploaded?" I walked down the hallway toward my office overlooking the Chicago River. The late afternoon light reflected off the water below, filling the room with a soft glow. Inside, 2 members of my team were waiting beside the conference table. One of them stood when I entered. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter," he said. "The partners are ready to review the Midwest restructuring case." The title still sounded strange sometimes. Managing partner. 2 years earlier, I had quietly been promoted to lead our firm's Midwest restructuring division. Our team specialized in complicated corporate recovery projects, the kind companies pursued when they were on the edge of collapse. We didn't just review paperwork. We decided whether companies survived. I stepped into the conference room where the rest of the team was waiting. Large monitors displayed financial charts and market reports. Several analysts were already discussing projections as I took my seat at the head of the table. "All right," I said. "Let's see what we have." One of the analysts pulled up the first presentation slide. A manufacturing company based in Ohio has approached several investment groups seeking capital, he explained. The company has declining revenue but still owns valuable equipment and property assets. I felt a quiet sense of recognition before he even switched to the next slide. The screen changed. Carter Manufacturing. For a moment, I simply looked at the name. My family's business had officially arrived in my conference room. No one else in the room knew that yet. The analyst continued speaking. The company is seeking significant investment to expand production capacity and regain regional market share. Another chart appeared on the screen showing projected growth. Revenue doubling within 2 years. Equipment upgrades. New supplier contracts. The same optimistic projections I had seen on the kitchen counter that morning. Another analyst leaned forward. Who submitted the proposal? The first analyst checked his notes. The request came through a consultant representing Carter Manufacturing leadership, he said. A woman named Vanessa Carter. There it was. My sister had already started negotiating. She had been contacting investment groups across the Midwest, pitching her expansion plan to anyone willing to listen. And eventually the proposal had reached my firm. The analyst switched to the financial section of the presentation. Initial review shows the company is carrying significant debt, he continued. However, they believe expansion could offset the liabilities. I studied the numbers on the screen. The projections looked almost identical to the documents I photographed that morning. Ambitious, aggressive, and dangerously optimistic. One of my senior analysts pointed at a particular section. These revenue assumptions rely on contracts that don't exist yet, he said. Another analyst nodded. And operating costs appear underestimated. The room grew quieter as everyone studied the figures more carefully. Finally, someone asked the question that mattered most. Do we know who will present the proposal to the investors? The first analyst checked his tablet again. Yes, he said. The company requested a live presentation next week here in Chicago. He paused before continuing. The presenter will be Vanessa Carter. Several members of the team nodded, making notes. To them, it was just another corporate pitch meeting. To me, it was something else entirely. My sister was coming to Chicago believing she was about to meet investors who could save the Carter family business. What she didn't know was that the meeting would take place in my conference room, and that the final decision about her deal would be made by the quiet sister she had always assumed stayed out of the way. The Carter manufacturing factory stood exactly where it always had, at the edge of Dayton beside the old rail line that used to carry shipments across half the state. When I pulled into the parking lot a few days later, the place looked both familiar and strangely smaller than I remembered. The building itself was still solid red brick, but the lot that once held rows of employee cars now had empty spaces scattered across it. A few loading docks were closed, their metal doors locked halfway down. The quiet felt different from the factory I grew up visiting as a child. Back then, the place had always been loud. Machines running, forklifts moving, workers shouting across the floor. Now the noise was thinner. My father was waiting near the front office when I stepped inside. You made it back, he said with a nod. I walked with him through the production floor, watching the workers move between older machines that had clearly been running longer than they were designed to. A few employees recognized me and waved politely. My father spoke with the pride of someone who still believed the factory could return to its former strength. Vanessa's been working nonstop, he said, talking to investors, putting together plans. She's really stepping up. There was relief in his voice, like he had been waiting for someone to take the pressure off his shoulders. Investors in Chicago seem interested, he added. That's where the real money is? I nodded but didn't answer. Across the floor, The office door opened and Vanessa stepped out. She was holding a tablet and talking quickly to one of the supervisors, pointing at numbers on the screen. When she noticed us, she smiled and walked over. "Perfect timing," she said. "I was just reviewing the latest projections." She looked energized, like someone already running the company. Several workers greeted her as she passed. "Morning. Vanessa, got those numbers ready?" It didn't take long to see that people here had already started treating her like the new leader. Vanessa tapped the tablet screen and showed my father a chart. "If we secure the investment next week, we can upgrade the production line within 6 months," she explained. "New machines, better contracts, higher output." My father looked impressed. "That fast?" "Absolutely," she said confidently. "We've been thinking too small for years." Within an hour, she had gathered several relatives and supervisors into the small conference room above the factory floor. My Uncle Mark sat near the front. Our cousin Tyler leaned against the wall beside a stack of logistics reports. Vanessa stood at the front like a CEO presenting a strategy. "Carter Manufacturing has been operating below its potential," she began. "But that's about to change." She tapped the screen and her presentation appeared on the monitor. Slides showing projected growth, charts predicting expanded market share, timelines for equipment upgrades. Everyone in the room listened carefully. Vanessa had always known how to command attention. "This investment deal will give us the capital we need," she continued. "New production contracts, expanded distribution, everything we've been missing." Several people nodded. My Uncle Mark smiled. "That's the kind of leadership this place needs." I sat quietly, studying the numbers. The same projections I had already reviewed in Chicago. The same assumptions. Revenue based on contracts that didn't exist yet. Costs that seemed suspiciously low. Vanessa finished the presentation to light applause. After the meeting ended, I caught up with her outside near the loading dock. The late afternoon sun was beginning to drop behind the factory roof, casting long shadows across the pavement. "You really believe those projections?" I asked. She crossed her arms, amused. "Emily, you've always been cautious. I prefer realistic." She shook her head. "That's why you stayed in law instead of business." The comment wasn't cruel, just confident, like she had already accepted the story our family told about us. "I've already scheduled the investor presentation in Chicago," she continued. "Once they see the numbers, everything moves forward." "How much debt will this require?" I asked. She shrugged. "Some, but that's how expansion works." "What about the collateral?" That question made her pause for the first time. Only for a second. "The investors want guarantees," she admitted. "Standard stuff. The factory property." "Of course." "And the house." Vanessa hesitated again. "It's just paperwork," she said. "No one expects the company to fail." Her tone suggested the risk barely existed. I looked out toward the quiet factory floor through the open doors. "You should read every line of that contract," I said. She laughed softly. "Relax, Emily. I know what I'm doing." Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to believe it. Because confidence had always been the language our family trusted most. As I walked back to my car that evening, the factory lights were flickering on behind me. Vanessa was convinced the Chicago meeting would be the biggest moment of her career. The investors would hear her pitch. The company would secure millions in funding. Everything would change. What she still didn't know was that the deal she had spent weeks chasing would be reviewed in a boardroom where I was the one sitting at the head of the table. And when she walked into that room, the story our family believed about us was finally going to collide with reality. The morning after I returned to Chicago, the city was already moving at full speed. Traffic crawled through the financial district, while the glass towers reflected the pale light of early morning. Inside our office building, the atmosphere was quieter, controlled in the way large firms always are when serious decisions are about to be made. By the time I reached my office, 3 analysts were already waiting with printed reports spread across the conference table. "Morning, Emily." One of them said, "The Carter Manufacturing file is ready." I set my bag down and opened the digital presentation on the screen. Vanessa's pitch appeared exactly the way she had shown it at the factory meeting in Dayton. Bold headlines, clean charts, a confident vision for the future of Carter Manufacturing. At first glance, it looked impressive. That was Vanessa's strength. She understood how to sell an idea before anyone had time to question it. The presentation began with the history of the company. A family-owned manufacturer with decades of regional success. A loyal workforce. A strong foundation ready for expansion. Slide after slide described the opportunity investors were supposedly looking at. Modernized equipment. New supplier contracts. Projected revenue growth that doubled within 2 years. Anyone unfamiliar with the details might have believed the story immediately. But numbers rarely behave as cleanly as presentation slides suggest. I opened the full financial model attached to the proposal. That was where the real story lived. One analyst leaned forward, pointing to the first problem. These revenue assumptions depend on contracts that haven't been secured yet. Another analyst nodded. And operating costs here are underestimated by at least 20%. The deeper we went into the documents, the more fragile the plan began to look. Vanessa's expansion strategy relied on large loans being approved quickly. Equipment upgrades would require millions in financing. New workers would need to be hired long before the projected contracts produced income. In other words, the company would be taking on significant debt before it had the revenue to support it. I moved to the final section of the agreement. The investment contract. This was the same document I had photographed in my parents' kitchen. But seeing it again in a corporate boardroom gave it a very different weight. The language was straightforward. Investors would provide capital in exchange for equity participation and financial control over certain operational decisions. Standard practice for companies seeking outside investment. Then I reached the clause that mattered most. Personal guarantees from company ownership required to secure the investment. Collateral to include manufacturing property and associated family assets. I read the line again. If Carter Manufacturing failed to meet the aggressive financial targets outlined in Vanessa's proposal, the investors could legally claim those assets, which meant the factory itself, and potentially the house my parents had lived in for almost 40 years. One of the analysts noticed my expression. "Problem?" he asked. I turned the screen toward the group. "This clause?" I said. They read it quickly. One of them let out a quiet whistle. "That's aggressive." "Very," another added, "especially for a company already carrying debt." We spent the next hour reviewing possible outcomes. Under ideal conditions, Vanessa's plan might succeed. If every projection turned out to be accurate, if the company secured new contracts quickly, if production expanded without delays. But businesses rarely follow ideal conditions. Under more realistic scenarios, the company would struggle to meet the aggressive growth targets built into the deal. And if that happened, the collateral clause would activate, meaning my family could lose everything. The room grew quiet as everyone considered the implications. One analyst leaned back in his chair. "If the representative presenting this plan is serious," he said, "she's either incredibly bold or dangerously uninformed." No one knew how accurate that observation was. My assistant knocked lightly and stepped into the room. "The Carter Manufacturing representative confirmed her travel schedule," she said. "She'll be here Thursday morning." I nodded. "Boardroom A." "Yes." The analysts exchanged looks. "That's the big room." One of them said, "It's the appropriate room for the investors attending." My assistant replied. She handed me the final meeting schedule. Presenter, Vanessa Carter. Location, Executive Boardroom. I studied the page for a moment. Vanessa believed she was about to walk into a room full of investors eager to hear her proposal. She believed the Chicago meeting would secure the capital needed to rebuild Carter Manufacturing. She believed she was leading the future of the family business. What she didn't realize was that the deal she had built depended on a recommendation from someone sitting quietly in this room. Someone she had spent most of her life assuming would never be part of those decisions. After the meeting ended, I remained alone in the conference room. Through the glass wall, The Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon. For years, I had allowed my family to believe the same story about me. The quiet daughter. The careful one. The sister who stayed out of leadership conversations. But in 3 days, Vanessa would walk into this building believing she controlled the future of the Carter family business. And when she stepped into that boardroom, she would finally realize something she had never considered before. The person deciding whether her plan lived or died would already be waiting at the head of the table. The morning of the meeting arrived with the quiet precision that always filled the financial district before major negotiations. By 8:30, our office floor was already active. Analysts moved between conference rooms carrying laptops and printed reports. Assistants checked presentation equipment while investors began arriving in the lobby downstairs. Boardroom A was prepared long before the first guest stepped inside. The room was larger than the other conference spaces in the building, designed specifically for high-stakes meetings. A long, polished table stretched across the center, surrounded by leather chairs and large screens displaying financial data. My team moved carefully through the final preparations. Financial models were loaded onto the monitors. Printed copies of the Carter manufacturing proposal sat neatly stacked in front of each seat. Outside the windows, the Chicago River reflected the early morning light. Inside the room, the atmosphere was calm but focused, the kind of quiet that comes before serious decisions. One of the investors arrived first, a senior partner from a Midwest private equity firm that specialized in distressed companies. He greeted my analysts politely before taking a seat halfway down the table. 2 more investors followed shortly after. Within minutes, the room began filling with experienced executives who had spent their careers evaluating companies on the edge of survival. None of them knew the personal connection I had to the proposal they were about to hear. One of my analysts leaned toward me quietly. "Everyone's here except the presenter," he said. I nodded and took my seat at the head of the table. From this position, I could see every person in the room. It was the seat reserved for whoever controlled the meeting. For years, my family believed I stayed silent because I didn't want authority. But the truth was simpler. Authority only mattered in the rooms where decisions were actually made. A few minutes later, my assistant stepped inside. "She's arrived in the lobby," she said. The investors glanced toward the door with mild curiosity. To them, this was simply the next presentation of the day. Downstairs, Vanessa walked through the lobby with the confident stride I had seen my entire life. She wore a dark blazer and carried a slim presentation folder under her arm. Anyone watching would have assumed she belonged in the building. She approached the front desk and introduced herself. "Vanessa Carter. I'm here for the investment meeting." The receptionist checked the schedule and nodded politely. "Of course. One of our analysts will bring you upstairs." Vanessa waited near the elevator with 2 junior analysts who had been sent to escort her to the executive floor. She spoke easily with them during the short elevator ride. "Carter Manufacturing has been around for decades," she explained. "The potential is enormous once the right investment comes in." The analysts listened quietly. Neither of them mentioned that the final decision about the deal would not be made by the investors she expected. When the elevator doors opened, Vanessa stepped into the executive hallway. Glass walls revealed offices filled with analysts studying financial reports. Assistants moved quickly between desks, carrying stacks of documents. Vanessa looked around with quiet appreciation. "This place is impressive," she said. One of the analysts smiled politely. "We handle a lot of corporate restructuring work here." Vanessa nodded confidently. "Well, hopefully today we'll be talking about expansion instead." They walked down the hallway toward the conference wing. My assistant met them near the end of the corridor. "Miss Carter," she said, offering a polite handshake. "They're ready for you." Vanessa straightened her jacket slightly. "Perfect," she replied. The boardroom door stood closed at the end of the hall. Inside, the investors were already seated. I glanced briefly at the financial reports in front of me, then looked toward the door just as my assistant reached for the handle. The room fell quiet. The door opened. Vanessa stepped inside confidently. Her eyes moved quickly around the table, taking in the investors, the analysts, the presentation screens. Then she saw me. For a moment her expression froze. The confident smile disappeared as confusion replaced it. She looked around the room again, as if trying to understand what she was seeing. My chair was positioned exactly where it always was for these meetings, at the head of the table, the position of the person leading the discussion. A few of the investors noticed the sudden change in her expression and exchanged curious looks. Vanessa's eyes returned to me. "Emily," she said quietly. Her voice carried more disbelief than anger. I gestured calmly toward the empty chair across from me. "Good morning, Vanessa," I said in a professional tone. "Please have a seat." She walked slowly toward the chair. The confident energy she had carried into the room was gone now, replaced by careful uncertainty. The door closed softly behind her, and for the first time since she began chasing this investment deal, Vanessa was beginning to realize something she had never considered before. The meeting she believed would secure the future of Carter Manufacturing was being led by the one person she had always assumed stayed quietly out of the way. Vanessa sat down slowly, still looking around the room as if she had stepped into the wrong meeting. The investors watched her with polite curiosity, but no one spoke. They were used to tension in boardrooms. Surprises happened all the time in business negotiations. For Vanessa, though, this was clearly not the meeting she expected. She opened her laptop carefully, her eyes flicking toward me once more before turning to the screen in front of her. "Good morning," she began, forcing a confident tone into her voice. "My name is Vanessa Carter, and I represent Carter Manufacturing." The presentation appeared on the large monitor behind her. Slides filled with charts, timelines, and projections. The same confident vision she had shown at the factory in Dayton. She started with the company's history. Carter Manufacturing has been a family-owned business for over 40 years, she said. At its peak, the company supported hundreds of jobs across the region. Several investors nodded politely. Vanessa moved through the slides with the same energy she had used in every room where she believed she held the advantage. "Our goal now is to modernize the company and reclaim a significant share of the regional manufacturing market." She spoke smoothly, confidently. For the first 10 minutes, no one interrupted. But eventually the questions began. One investor leaned forward slightly. "What is the company's current debt position?" he asked. Vanessa clicked to the financial slide. "We currently carry several equipment loans and operating lines," she said. "But those liabilities will become manageable once production increases." Another investor glanced down at the printed documents in front of him, and the supply contracts required to support this increase in production. Vanessa smiled. "We're already in discussions with several potential partners." The investor nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wanted more details. I watched the exchange quietly until Vanessa reached the slide showing projected revenue growth. The chart showed a sharp upward curve over the next 2 years. That was when I finally spoke. "Vanessa," I said calmly. She paused and looked at me. "Yes. Could you explain the assumptions behind your production expansion?" Her confidence returned slightly. "Of course," she said. "Once we secure the investment capital, we'll upgrade the machinery and increase output significantly. And the contracts to support that output, they're expected to follow once capacity improves." One of the investors glanced toward me with interest. I leaned forward slightly. "So the revenue projections assume contracts that haven't been secured yet." Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second. "That's correct," she admitted. "But the demand is there." I nodded and flipped open the financial report in front of me. "And operating costs," I continued, "are projected to increase by less than 10% despite doubling production." One of my analysts shifted in his chair, watching the numbers carefully. Vanessa cleared her throat. "Those are preliminary estimates." I turned to the next page of the agreement. "There's also the matter of the collateral clause." The room grew quiet. Vanessa looked confused. "What clause?" I slid a copy of the investment agreement across the table toward her. "The one requiring personal guarantees from company ownership." She glanced down at the page. For a moment she said nothing. One of the investors spoke. "If Carter Manufacturing fails to meet the financial targets outlined in this agreement, he said carefully. The collateral listed here could be claimed by lenders. Vanessa looked back at the document. The factory property, he continued. And associated family assets? Understanding slowly spread across her expression. The room remained silent. Several investors studied her reaction closely. This was the moment when confidence alone stopped being enough. I spoke again, still calmly. Did you explain this clause to your family? Vanessa's eyes moved between the document and the investors. I reviewed the contract, she said quietly. One of the investors leaned back in his chair. These terms are not unusual for high-risk expansion financing, he said, but they do require a full understanding of the consequences. Vanessa looked across the table at me. This time her expression wasn't confident. It was uncertain. Her phone vibrated softly on the table. She glanced down. Dad calling. She excused herself and stepped into the hallway. Through the glass wall, I could see her pacing slowly while speaking into the phone. Her voice was too quiet to hear clearly, but the tension in her posture said enough. After a few minutes, she returned to the room. Her confidence was gone now, replaced by something more careful. The investors looked toward me. As managing partner, my recommendation would determine whether the deal moved forward. Vanessa sat quietly across the table, watching me. For the first time in our lives, she wasn't the one leading the conversation. I closed the financial report slowly and placed it on the table. If Carter Manufacturing proceeds with this agreement exactly as written, I said calmly, your family could lose everything. The words settled heavily across the room. No one spoke. The investors waited. Vanessa waited. And now the future of the Carter family business depended entirely on what I said next. No one in the room spoke after I said it. If Carter Manufacturing proceeds with this agreement exactly as written, your family could lose everything. The sentence seemed to settle across the boardroom like a weight pressing down on the table. Vanessa stared at the contract page in front of her, reading the same clause again as if the words might change the second time. Around the room, the investors waited patiently. They had seen moments like this before. Confidence meeting reality. One of the senior partners folded his hands on the table and looked toward me. Is there another structure you would recommend? He asked. The question shifted the focus of the room immediately. Vanessa lifted her head slowly. For the first time since she walked into the meeting, she wasn't the one in control of the conversation. All eyes were on me. I opened the financial report again and turned a few pages. Carter Manufacturing isn't the problem, I said calmly. The structure of this deal is... Several investors leaned forward slightly. Vanessa watched me carefully. The company still has valuable assets. I continued. Experienced workers, usable equipment, and a recognizable regional supplier history. I pointed at one of the financial charts on the screen. But expansion financed by heavy debt creates unnecessary risk. The senior partner nodded slowly. What would you suggest instead? A restructuring plan, I said. The room grew quieter. First, stabilize operations, I explained. Renegotiate the current loans. Replace outdated equipment gradually instead of all at once. Build revenue from confirmed contracts before expanding production. One of the investors glanced at the numbers. That would reduce the capital required. Yes, I said, and it removes the need for personal guarantees tied to family assets. Vanessa looked down again at the contract in front of her. For the first time since she started chasing this investment deal, she understood what that clause really meant. Her voice was softer when she finally spoke. You're saying the company can still survive? I met her eyes. Yes, I said. But not the way you planned. The investors began quietly discussing the revised approach among themselves. Several of them flipped through the documents again, now reviewing the company from a different perspective. One of them finally looked up. If the company follows this restructuring strategy, he said, our firm would consider participating. Another investor nodded. It's a far more stable investment. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair. The tension in her shoulders slowly loosened. For the first time since the meeting began, the conversation no longer felt like a test she was about to fail. The formal discussion lasted another 30 minutes. Details about revised financing, possible timelines, operational improvements. When the meeting finally ended, the investors stepped out to discuss the proposal privately. The boardroom grew quiet again. Vanessa remained sitting across from me, staring at the empty seats around the table. She let out a slow breath. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice carried none of the confidence she had walked into the room with. "You never told anyone," she added. I closed the laptop in front of me. "There was never a reason to—" She looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. "You're running this place," she said. "Part of it. And you just never mentioned that at home." I shrugged slightly. Family dinners never seemed like the right place for corporate titles. She shook her head slowly. "All these years I thought you stayed quiet because you didn't want to lead anything." "That's one interpretation," I said. Vanessa laughed quietly. "You could have destroyed that deal in 5 minutes," she said. "That wouldn't have helped the company." She studied me for a moment. "So instead you saved it." I didn't answer immediately. Outside the windows, the Chicago River moved slowly between the towers. "Carter Manufacturing deserves a chance to survive," I said finally. "And Dad deserves to see it continue." Vanessa nodded. For the first time in our lives, there was no competition in the room between us. Just understanding. A few weeks later, the restructuring plan was finalized. The investors agreed to support the company under the revised structure. Carter Manufacturing didn't suddenly become a massive success story overnight. But the factory lights stayed on. The workers kept their jobs. And the company that my grandfather built continued to operate. My father eventually learned what happened in that boardroom. He didn't say much about it. But the next time I visited Dayton, he looked at me differently. Not as the quiet daughter sitting at the edge of the table, but as someone who had quietly protected everything he spent his life building. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's simply allowing the truth to appear when the moment finally arrives. For years, my family believed my sister ran everything. But when the future of our family business was on the line, the final decision happened in my office. And if you've ever been underestimated by people who thought they already knew your worth, I'd really like to hear about it. Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one carrying the most power. And stories like this remind us that patience can change everything. If you enjoy real stories about family drama, hidden strength, and those moments when the tables finally turn, make sure to stay with the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.